What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
America Trends at your disposal. Larry Rifkin and John Krofsick. And you might wonder, what's on the docket today? Well, you saw, if you went to our website or to Apple or Google or wherever you find our podcast, that we're going to be focused on Army of None. So, John, what does that mean? You start an army and nobody shows up?
Well, that would be nice if that's what happened, but I think
Wouldn't
this
that be
is
great?
A little more evil.
Yeah,
Yes.
we're calling everybody to duty, and nobody anywhere shows up, so we have to have peace.
We can have a war of none.
Yeah, a war of none. I like that, or no more war. Well, the book is called Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War.
Yeah,
and
this is a little more sinister than nobody shows
well,
up.
this is almost mind-boggling as to the implications of having a war where at least one side, the one that is so technologically advanced that nobody dies.
Well, we're sort of doing this with drones, you know. I mean, we can fly them over. Our guys sit in Florida and they fly them over Afghanistan and shoot at people. I mean, we're
or you've got that nice remote
there.
control war that we've been doing for so many years, where we have somebody in a base in Florida or out in the Midwest, and they're shooting at people in the Middle East, and they're going out to lunch from noon to 1 every day.
It's
How
kind
does
of
that
scary.
work?
It's scary.
It really is.
The future is kind of scary with this technology, I think.
And it has so many philosophical implications. I mean, John, you and I have talked on this program about the fact that perhaps we are more predisposed to use force when, in fact, we never vote on wars, we never pay for wars, and only a select number of people, underrepresented politically, the poor, the dispossessed, and those in the rural areas in America, end up fighting our wars disproportionately.
And we got a media that has turned a blind eye to the wars. I mean, so who even knows that we're still at war, and who even knows that we got a battleship outside of Syria ready to hit? I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Well, we are isolated from many of the impacts. Those of us who have gone to college or been educated, we don't join any longer. We're not drafted into service. But this goes a step even beyond that.
Yeah, this is
so
scary.
Already, we're not afraid to deploy and redeploy and redeploy because, well, nobody's yelling, nobody's screaming about it. Unfortunately, these families who are affected really are. But what happens when, in fact, we can have war without a lot of bloodshed, on our side at least, if we're the ones who are controlling the dynamics of this technology?
Well,
what happens?
We're not the only ones working on this technology, so which brings it another step even more scary, because, you know, they could let this loose anywhere. You know, it's not good.
Well, what happens when these autonomous weapons are let to roam free, and they can go here on Earth, they can be above, and I know that the president has been talking about a space force because there is going to be a lot of activity out there. There's cyber warfare that is going on that could cripple us.
Well,
if somebody takes
China
down...
has been working on stuff in space. So I think that's why you see this you know, Trump coming up with this, because they're working on it. So,
well, what could go catastrophically wrong in all of this?
Wow.
A lot.
And
that's what we're going to talk about today on America Trends. So hold on. If you thought that war was an awful topic and one that you hate even to discuss, well, it is. But we have to, and we're now looking at a whole new realm of warfare. I think it's best expressed in some of the thinking that has gone into this book, Army of None. With us on America Trends is Paul Scharre, and he is the author of Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War. He's also the director of the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, and he led the Autonomous Weapons Program at the Pentagon. Paul, you're a former U.S. Army Ranger, 4 tours, and one of your most vivid memories was of a man you didn't shoot, and as it turns out, a good decision. Tell us how that incident informs your thinking about these weapons that, in effect, can make life and death decisions without human intervention.
So one of the incidents I talk about in the book was I was in Afghanistan, in eastern Afghanistan, up near the Pakistan border, in a reconnaissance team very high up in the mountains. And there was an individual approaching toward us, and it just wasn't clear whether he could be either an innocent farmer or maybe a goat herder, or could be a Taliban fighter trying to sneak up on us. And certainly there are plenty of examples. This was, I think, my 3rd tour at this point in time. Plenty of examples of both of those types of people in the area. And so he came up, and I circled around back and got into a position where I could watch him. And I was watching him, and I could hear that it sounded like maybe he was talking to someone, and I didn't know if he had a radio. It might be reporting back our position. I was trying to sort of piece together what I was seeing from various clues, try to understand, well, what's this person's intent. Mm-hmm. And I finally realized that he started singing, and he was singing to his goats. And I thought, well, that seems the most probable thing here is that he's a goat herder singing to his goats. He's probably not singing over the radio to another fighter. It seems like an odd thing to do. And that's what he was doing. And so I watched him for a while and then let him go. And so I mentioned this in the book because now people are building machines that will look to make these life and death decisions in war. And sometimes these decisions are very easy. It's very clear who the enemy is. But then there are other situations like that one where it really takes understanding the human mind, understanding human intent, piecing together different clues, because the enemy doesn't always wear a uniform. And, the real question that the book grapples with is how would machines be able to do in that kind of situation, making life and death decisions?
Do you think we'll ever be able to program machines well enough to think as the human mind might?
I mean, we certainly are able to program machines today to do things that look kind of like thought, kind of like thinking in a very narrow way. Machines have been able to not just execute programming and follow scripts that humans give them, but actually learn how to play games on their own. Machines have taught themselves how to play chess, how to play the Chinese strategy game Go. And what we're seeing is in those very narrow instances, they're actually learning things that are different than how humans play the game. So in a sense, they're thinking actually different than humans think. And in powerful ways, they've been able to beat human performance at those games. But it's very narrow kind of thinking. They can't, also, go make a cup of coffee or hold a conversation. Getting to the place where we have human-like intelligence, that's, at least right now, looks a much further ways away.
Taking one more example, I've got to tell you, I was kind of stunned by the way you opened the book, the introduction, about the night of September 26, 1983. And you said the world almost ended that night, and none of us had any clue about that. So to inform our conversation about where we're going with robotics in terms of the technology of war, explain the importance of that night.
It's an astonishing incident in the Cold War that we only found out about much later, but we came perilously close to Armageddon. There was a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sitting in a early warning bunker outside of Moscow. And his job was to monitor the early warning radar systems and satellite systems that would warn the Soviet Union of a U.S. nuclear attack. And that night, the alert went off. And it told him that the United States had launched not one, not two, but 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear armed, against the Soviet Union. Now, he's sitting in this bunker, and the system is showing his alerts, and it's flashing. There's a launch, and it's telling him that this is happening. It's a real event. But he's suspicious because he knows that the Soviets just installed a new satellite early warning system. And he knows that, as we know in our daily lives, new technology sometimes is a little buggy right out the gate. So he's suspicious. So he picks up the phone, calls the early warning radars that should start to see these missiles come over the horizon. And the radar operators say, well, we don't see them. So he says later on that in his mind it was 50-50 whether this was real. But he figured that if it was real, if it was a real attack, we were probably all doomed anyways, because the Soviet Union would retaliate and we'd go to nuclear war. But if it was false, then he certainly shouldn't report up that it was real and maybe risk nuclear war. So he picks up the phone and he tells his superiors that the system is malfunctioning. And we know now that that's correct. There was no attack. But here's an instance where one person's gut call potentially saved all of humanity. And what would a machine have done? Well, whatever we programmed it to do, it doesn't know the stakes of its decisions. It doesn't understand the billions of lives that might suffer as a consequence. So that's a really stark real-world example where the machine made a decision, the machine was wrong, and a human intervened to say, well, this doesn't make sense to me.
You say that the line between automatic, automated, and autonomous systems is blurry, and I think a lot of us are probably confused about how much we're willing and able to relinquish to the machines.
It's a real tricky question. It's one that we're facing in a whole variety of settings in our lives. We're certainly seeing this in a very stark way in automobiles today. And you see different sort of models for how we operate automobiles. There's an older model that's phasing out where we manually drive cars. There are very few cars that are actually entirely mechanically driven at all. In most automobiles today, when you move the steering wheel or push the accelerator or brake, you're interfacing with a computer. And you're giving signals to that computer, and then the computer is giving signals to the actual brakes or the engine or the steering on the car. Then we see more advanced features coming onto new automobiles, like self-parking, intelligent cruise control. Tesla has a more advanced autopilot feature that's been unfortunately involved in some accidents. And then we see some companies like Google and others really pushing the boundaries towards totally autonomous self-driving cars. But in all of these instances, we're talking about a very narrow kind of function. It's just driving. Even in a fully autonomous car, if you want to use that term, the human is still deciding the destination. So sometimes we get caught up in these terms of, well, is it automated or is it autonomous? I've been in many conversations in the Pentagon, at the United Nations, where people get tangled around these terms. But the most important thing is, what is the task the machine is performing? And how do we balance what the machine is doing with the humans? Again, you might be willing to get into a car that drives itself if the human picks the destination. And in wartime, similarly, we want to, instead of sort of thinking about, well, is it automated, is it autonomous, we want to know what tasks is the machine doing and what is the human doing. And in particular, when it comes to lethal force, who's making the call about what targets are being engaged? Who's deciding to use lethal force? Is that the human or is that the machine?
So today, you would say it's all the humans still.
That's right. So there are drones, robotic vehicles being used all around the globe. There are at least 90 countries and many non-state groups like the Islamic State that have drones today, but they're largely remotely controlled. And similar to automobiles, we're seeing more automation come into that. But the sort of the key line that many people agree is at least a significant line to cross is getting to the place where machines have to do their own targeting and kill decisions. And we're not there right now, but we're seeing more countries build ever more advanced robotic weapons. The United States has fielded a fully uninhabited robotic ship. It's a warship that's designed to patrol the seas, to track enemy submarines, and there will be no one on board. And it's part of the U.S. fleet now. Russia is building a whole fleet of armed ground vehicles and just deployed one to Syria a couple months ago. Now, it had some problems. They had to recall it, but they're going to improve the technology. It's going to get better over time. And as it gets more advanced, the real question that's hanging out there is, will countries be willing to cross this line and allow machines to make these targeting and lethal decisions all on their own.
And of course, you grapple in the book with a lot of the ethical and philosophical questions that are raised by all of this. And do you think that man and that policymakers have really begun to imagine what this means and whether we remove the process from the human mind, where we're headed?
I mean, in some small ways, the international community has begun to grapple with this problem. But I do think that there's a lot of work that's needed ahead. There have been discussions going on internationally at the United Nations for 5 years now. There will be another meeting at the end of August where countries are coming together to talk about this problem. Now, there is widespread disagreement about what this future might look like if these weapons are built. On the one hand, there are some members of civil society, some non-governmental peace organizations, Human Rights Watch, and many others, saying that if we build these weapons, it'll be terrible. They'll go rogue. They'll make mistakes. They'll make accidents. They'll kill civilians. It'll be a horrific tragedy. There have been several thousand artificial intelligence and robotics researchers who have similarly said, we don't want countries to build these, and have pledged that they won't work on this technology. And there was just a pledge signed very recently by AI scientists saying, they're renouncing any kind of autonomous weapon. On the other hand, you do hear arguments from some engineers, some lawyers, some ethicists, others saying, look, this technology might make war more humane. Not that militaries might want it just because it's better, but it actually might save lives. The same way that self-driving cars could avoid pedestrians, be better than humans at driving, and save lives there, maybe autonomous weapons could avoid civilians and only target the enemy accurately and save lives and prevent civilian casualties.
But as you said, when you think about the wars today, they're so asymmetrical, and many of the warriors that were fighting on the other side don't wear a uniform.
Well, that's what makes this really tricky, is in what environment are we envisioning these weapons? And, on the one hand, you can envision some environments that are very sterile, if you will, that they don't have many civilians in them. So a robotic undersea drone that would be hunting enemy submarines. Well, if it's a large metal object underwater, it's a military submarine. It's not a hospital. There's nothing else it's going to be. There aren't civilians living underwater. Now, it might be your submarine, and that's a problem for military. But it's not going to be a civilian target. On the other hand, and when militaries think about this technology, for the most part, they're really interested in using this technology to target other pieces of military hardware, ships and submarines and fighter aircraft and tanks and radars and mobile missile launchers. Those are the threats they're really concerned about. From the human rights standpoint, many of the human rights groups are really worried about environments that look much more like Syria today, or some of these messy conflicts where people aren't in uniform, civilians are mixed among the population, like what you see in the Ukraine, for example. And that's a place where it would be much more challenging to envision these weapons being deployed in a way that would be lawful and safe.
What do these military reconnaissance drones, say the feared predator, represent in this army of none as to where we are today with this technology?
They're sort of like a Predator is a little bit like the Wright brothers airplane at Kitty Hawk of where military robotics is going. It's just an initial proof of concept. And a Predator, drone is not very sophisticated, but it's sort of the initial step in the direction towards this technology that over time will become much more advanced and sophisticated and probably be used in ways that are hard to foresee today. Just like the Wright brothers may have been, struggle to, foresee sort of intercontinental, supersonic travel. And so I think one of the challenges for militaries as they grapple with this is it's this competitive environment where there's lots of innovation and the cost of falling behind is very stark. Countries could lose a war. They could be defeated by an enemy. And so, on the one hand, you have all of the concerns about these weapons. On the other hand, you have the reality that countries don't trust each other. That's why they have militaries in the first place. And that's really what's holding back any kind of international agreement to maybe pump the brakes on this technology which is that all these major military powers believe that regardless of what they say, their adversaries are probably racing ahead in secret to develop this anyway.
Well, how true is that? And Paul, what's going on with the United States? We have been in an arms race for so many years with the Soviet Union, the Russians, we talk about that, and America's spending preponderantly so much more than any other country on our arms. We've increased our defense budget. How much is going into these autonomous weapons?
Yeah, so all of the major military powers around the globe are investing heavily in military robotics. And the leading countries here are really the U.S., Russia, China, Israel, France, and the United Kingdom, and South Korea. And they're moving out.
Well, at least most of them are allies, we think.
That's right. Many of them are allies, which is a good thing. But the United States is certainly very concerned about what Russia and China are doing, and they're being very aggressive in this technology. China launched last year a new artificial intelligence national strategy, which the United States does not have, saying that China plans to be the global leader in artificial intelligence by 2030. And they have a very aggressive research and development plan and a plan for recruiting top talent from all around the globe to come to China. And we're seeing major U.S. tech companies like Google and others opening AI research centers in China, which will certainly feed into this. So that's certainly a major, major challenge in this space. Now, what's not clear is whether these countries would be willing to sort of go this last final step and take humans away entirely from these killing decisions. Pentagon leaders have said their intention is to keep humans in the loop. That is, humans making the decision about whom to kill and having final responsibility for lethal force. Russia has not said anything like that, and China has been fairly quiet until last April, the very last day. They released a rather ambiguous statement talking about some kind of potentially regulation or narrow ban, but it's not clear exactly what it means. And I think it's safe to say that there's a fair amount of skepticism in the international community about what China exactly means by it.
Is there any tie, Paul, between what the president was talking about with a space force and what we're talking about today?
I guess on one level, one could say that that satellites are robots in a simple way. But the technology in autonomy and autonomous weapons is not limited to any one domain. It's really the brains of robotic systems, and it's applicable in space, on the air, under sea, at sea and on land. And in many cases, what might matter the most is the algorithms, the software that's behind these systems that can then get replicated and used in many different settings. It might even be algorithms that come from the commercial space. Maybe, algorithms that govern warehouse robots and optimize their algorithms for, moving boxes around that then militaries use to optimize some of their functionality and some of their decision making. And so it's certainly not, the essence of this technology, what makes it so hard to regulate and to restrain is in the software, not in the physical hardware.
Paul Scharre is with us, the author of Army of None. Paul, is there one branch of the military and one particular use that's advanced in relation to the others?
What's really fascinating is that the military services, by and large, are all very interested, at least in the United States, interested in moving out in robotic vehicles for supporting functions, logistics and tanking and reconnaissance, but not for the combat roles of their own service. So, for example, the U.S. Air Force is totally fine with reconnaissance aircraft, but not in combat roles. Those are for humans, and the robots are there to assist the humans. Now, if you go to the U.S. Army, the Army uses unmanned aircraft in combat roles, doesn't bother them. They have a very interesting and very innovative approach where they pair their drones with their Apache helicopters, and they're armed, and they're using them in very creative ways. You go to the ground combat element, though, which is really core to the Army's identity, and then you see a little bit slower pace in how the Army is incorporating ground robotics. And you see this sort of across the board in the Navy as well, that, people tend to not want to give up the jobs, whether that's being a tanker or a fighter pilot, that really define them in their military roles.
You talked about the fact that a lot of this is metal on metal, but we see a landscape, because we've all watched Terminator-style movies, of these killer robots. Is that science fiction or science future?
Well, it's becoming science future and science now. It's becoming more and more real today. Now, the killer robots, if you will, may not look like beady-eyed humanoid robots from the Terminator films. They may look like, missiles, more advanced swarming missiles that choose their own targets, or aircraft that can hunt their own targets. Or in some cases, they may not be physical systems with physical hardware at all. There are incredibly advanced things happening in cyberspace. And we've already seen with cyber weapons like Stuxnet that attacked Iranian centrifuges and damaged Iranian enrichment facilities, the ability for people to create cyber weapons that have very real destructive effects. And we're seeing more and more autonomy and automation in cyberspace. And so that's a very critical frontier as this technology moves forward.
Well, help us with that, because everybody believes that particular worm that got into the Iranian system was generated by the U.S. and Israel. And yet, on the other hand, as we talk about our own election systems, we sound like we're helpless and defenseless. Where is America as it relates to even our cyber capabilities and our robotics in so many ways in terms of our offense and our defense? Are we really a lot stronger than we know? Why is it we're not protecting ourselves in all ways?
The fundamental problem in cyberspace is there's this asymmetry, there's an imbalance between offense and defense. And so it's much easier to penetrate other systems and attack them and steal information and sabotage them than it is to keep everything secure. So it's imagine we've built sort of these walls around our security systems, but to defend them accurately, you have to, protect the entire perimeter of the wall. It's a big wall, and there's lots of areas for people to sneak in, and it's much easier for someone to find ways to sneak into our systems, and vice versa. And so you see things like hack of Equifax, of the government's Office of Personnel Management database, and other things where there's information being exfiltrated. There's concerns that have come to light about Russia exploring the U.S. Electrical system, electrical grid, and potentially doing something that might lay the foundations for sabotage later. And so the way that our digital systems are built today, it's very difficult to secure them. Now, one of the things that automation is potentially very valuable in is creating automated tools to begin to patch these vulnerabilities. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency at the Pentagon, has done this a couple of years ago through a cyber grand challenge. The technology is being now used by the Defense Department to, instead of having the people go through all of this code and find these bugs and patch these vulnerabilities, there are now automated tools that can do this all on their own. And that's a really significant frontier for AI, and a place where we might be able to tilt this offense-defense balance in a better direction.
If we assume that America stands above a lot of other nations, or most all nations, in terms of deployment of advanced technologies, and for all that we can't seem to achieve victory in any of our recent conflicts, does that get the policymakers and those who work out strategy wondering what advantage we're going to have going forward, given the nature of warfare today, even using this advanced technology?
Yeah, certainly in the wars that America has been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and now Syria, we have tremendous technological advantages over our adversaries. But we found it's been very hard to translate that into political success. And part of that is that the nature of those wars involves much more than simply breaking things, which the U.S. military can do quite well. It involves rebuilding a lasting political and social infrastructure that's conducive to American interests. And that's very hard. I spent a lot of time in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's deep tribalism and distrust in both countries, and those aren't things that can be easily fixed through some kind of advanced missile. When you look forward to the future with other countries, though, I would say that I don't assume that the United States will keep this technological edge, particularly vis-a-vis China. China is making major investments. The U.S. is ahead in some spaces, but China is catching up more quickly. And so, if you're running a race and you're ahead, but you look over your shoulder and the person behind you is gaining, that's certainly not a time to slack off.
Paul, what I like about your book is that you don't offer us any certainty in all of this because it's so fast evolving and it is so complicated and there are so many philosophical questions and you grapple with the upside and the downside of these issues. Let me pose it this way. We now deploy and redeploy with no draft, and 99% of the families in America today disengage from military service, as if young recruits are mercenaries in some way, and I hate to say that. But if we step back and we rely less on the humans, will it make us even more prone to use this army of none?
I think it is a risk. And I think you highlight, though, that the main shift, which we've already seen, really, is this shift to an all-volunteer military. And unfortunately, a huge disengagement from the American public in servicing these wars. I mean, the concept of the volunteer military was that it might be more equitable and that people could choose if they wanted to go, and we would pay them more and then tax society as a whole. And the reality is that even as we fought these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we didn't even raise taxes after 9/11.
Absolutely.
Right?
We don't vote on the wars, we don't pay for them, and many people are exempt from service.
That's right. And I'll be just totally honest with you. When I came back every time from those tours, the thing that was hardest was the level of disengagement of the public from the wars. And people were always very supportive. People would always thank me for my service. But in the day-to-day life of Americans, the country has not been at war. While the Army and Marine Corps certainly very much have been, and we've had people who've been deployed, numerous times, put an incredible strain on families. And I don't think that that's healthy for the country going forward. Now, certainly, robotics and automation exacerbates this in some way. But I think it's worth highlighting that we have choices. We have choices about how we use technology, about the social and political systems we put in place, about the bargains that we make with our citizens and with our military service members. And we have choices in society about how much we engage the American public and make sure that they have a stake in some of these issues of U.S. foreign policy.
But given what we've done, I'm just wondering, I think there was an old Star Trek years ago where there were these war games played with robots, but then as a result of who won or lost, a certain number of people were going to be taken out and killed. And of course, this is science fiction, but if we have no skin in the game, so to speak, what does that suggest?
Well, I think the question is sort of whose skin in the game are we talking about, right? I mean, certainly we're at a place today where the American public writ large has very little skin in the game in conflicts that the U.S. is fighting on the globe. But the people who are fighting have a lot. And I don't think that's actually likely to change. I think that even as we see robotics increase some degree of remoteness, that war is going to involve violence on both sides. The long history of technology and warfare has been towards greater distance. In the Stone Age, people picking up a rock and throwing it at someone, and then moving to bows and arrows and firearms and cannons and missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles today. And robotics will increase that distance, but it's still people fighting other people. They're just doing it with missiles. And in the future, they'll be doing it with robots. But I do think that we'll still see people at risk. And we'll still see violence and war. It will remain very much a human endeavor.
So your book says army of none. Are we ever going to see that?
I think from a physical risk standpoint, no. I think the real risk is this: is that you might get to a place where people feel psychologically disconnected from what's happening, right? So the real danger here is if someone launches the robot to go fight, and maybe there's a robot coming after me too, right? But launches the robot. And then someone says, well, I didn't do any killing today. The robot did the killing. That's one of the risks I talk about in this thing. And it's not about physically not having skin in the game. It's sort of more about being psychologically disconnected from the cost of war and what we're inflicting on the enemy. And I think that is a real risk worth thinking about, is what would that say about us as a society? What would that mean for warfare? What would the consequences be for the kinds of killing that might happen in war if people no longer felt responsible for the horrors of war?
When we have that mother of all bombs and we launch that in Syria and we launch it from an offshore position, are we not getting pretty close to what you're talking about?
Well, so I think, the key question here is about psychological distance and human responsibility. And so it's a tricky one because, the real question is, does someone pushing the button take ownership of that? Do they feel the weight of that decision? And there's a lot of interesting analysis that says that physical distance matters, but there's also a lot of things that we can do to shape how people feel responsible for these decisions. And so some of it's about culture, some of it's about how we present the information to people and the technology. But I think it is important to acknowledge that, one, we are already at a place of remoteness, where we launch cruise missiles from a ship offshore. And as we invest in more automation, that we not cross some threshold where humans no longer feel responsible at all for what is happening.
Do we now look upon this as something of an immediate situation that we have to address, given how quickly the technologies are ramping up? So is there, and you talked about it at the beginning, but maybe now that we have a little bit more perspective, where is an international tribunal to really study these impacts, talk around all of these philosophical questions? Is the world community really ready to take this issue on?
Well, the nations have been coming together, at least around 100 countries have been coming together, along with several dozen non-governmental organizations and international organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross at the United Nations to have these discussions for 5 years now. And they'll have the next one at the end of April. And it's, the problem is that you're dealing with a complex issue. The terminology is difficult. I have been in all of these conversations to date, and I'll just be totally honest, the first year we had a week of meetings, and we got to the very end, and many of the participants said, well, we're not talking about drones at all. We said, no, we're not talking about drones. We're talking about autonomous weapons, about what might come after drones. And they said, oh, well, what is that? And we said, well, we'll talk again next year. And so the pace of diplomacy is moving very slowly. These discussions only go on for about a week at a time. So there may be, if you add them up, maybe 5 weeks of discussion. And it is really out of pace with the technology because the technology is moving forward so quickly. And that is a big challenge to bring countries together to talk about this complex issue across multiple different languages and to bring everyone to the same sheet of music when the art of the possible in the technology is always evolving.
Paul Scharre, thank you so much for being with us. The book is called Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War. And very, very interesting. And thanks for being with us today on America Trends.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.